Well, good evening and welcome. I'm John Richardson. I'm the president of the Arlington Historical Society, and it's a great pleasure to have you all here tonight for what should be a fascinating talk by Dr. Nancy Perry. It's about the destruction of Queen City, and our speaker is Dr. Nancy Perry, who has lived in Arlington since 1974. In 2013, she received her PhD in geography from George Mason University. Her dissertation explores the influence that geography had on the lives of the African-American residents of Arlington County during segregation. This presentation is a continuation of her dissertation research, but it's basically, and she'll tell you more, about the destruction of over a largely a predominantly black community, which was on the Pentagon grounds, that was uprooted, moved away in order to build the Pentagon during World War II. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Nancy Perry. Good.
Thank you for that. Do I have to pull this down, or can you hear me? Thank you very much for coming. I was so afraid I was going to be talking to the four walls. I bullied a few people into coming, but not this many. I'm quite excited that so many of you decided to come tonight. Also, thank you for the Arlington Historical Society for inviting me to come. I want to talk to you today about a small African-American community called East Arlington. If you've never heard of East Arlington, it's because it's not there anymore. In 1942, using eminent domain, the War Department leveled East Arlington in order to make way for the building of the brand new Pentagon. And that's the story that I want to tell you about today. Now, up on my slide, I have a picture of East Arlington in happier times. This picture was taken in 1934. And if you look on this road here, this is Columbia Pike. If you followed Columbia Pike down to the horizon, you would get down to the Potomac River. So that's where we are. So if you were going down Columbia Pike towards the Potomac River, East Arlington would be this part right here. It's on the left-hand side of the road, starting right here with this road. This is Arlington Ridge Road. And those of you who lived in East Arlington, I see one person way in the back who did live in East Arlington. You would know this store. That's the Hyman's grocery store. Okay? Now, just to give you a better idea of where this is taking place, here is the Potomac River. This is a map from 1945, so a few things are missing, like the Roosevelt Bridge. But you can see where the Potomac River is. You can see where Arlington Cemetery is. You see where the brand new Pentagon is. And this little piece right here was East Arlington. Okay, so it wasn't actually underneath the Pentagon. It was very close to the Pentagon. And notice this lagoon right here, because we're going to see that later on another map. So this is, when I say, okay, here's that lagoon I was talking about, that's a lagoon I'm talking about, okay? This is what I'm going to tell you about today. This is not my story. I did not live in East Arlington. And so I'm telling somebody else's story. The first people that I learned about this one, or no, this is what I'm going to cover. My data sources. I'm going to talk to you about building the Pentagon, because building the Pentagon is the reason that East Arlington got leveled. I'm going to describe East Arlington to you. I'm going to talk to you about the law of eminent domain, because that was what the War Department used in order to level East Arlington. That was how they were able to level East Arlington. Then in the eminent domain law, it says that the government is allowed to take privately owned property, but when they do that, they have to pay the people back. And that's called compensation, but they have to give them fair compensation, and the Constitution calls it just compensation. So what we're going to look at is, okay, well, what did the government take then? What did those people lose? And what did they give them in return? And then you can decide if they got just compensation or not. Okay. Now, this is the part where I was going to say this is not my story. This is other people's story, so I had to learn about this story. I had to talk to people who lived through this. And so my first and favorite source of data was interviews. I interviewed 9 folks who had lived in East Arlington during the time when this happened. Now, this happened in 1942, so the people I talked to were teenagers when it happened, because anybody that was an adult has since passed on. And so we were looking at it in the interviews from a teenager's point of view. Well, I also wondered, well, how did this look to an adult? And of course, I couldn't find any adults to talk to, but I could use oral histories. And Arlington Central Library has an excellent oral history program where they interview Arlingtonians who have an interesting story to tell, and they write their histories down, and then you can go in the local, what do we call it now? Center for Local History, used to be called the Virginia Room, and they will show you where those oral histories are. Lucky for me, there were some oral histories of people who had lived in East Arlington and were adults at the time that East Arlington was leveled. So I also used that data source. Those are just like reading interviews, except I didn't get to do the interviewing. Then I also used census records, and I'm going to show you what those census records look like. They were very useful. I also used land records, that's deeds. I also used old newspapers, and I'll show you one of those, and then I used as many photographs as I could find. Okay? So let's get started. This is what the census data looks like. This is called manuscript census data. This is the form that the census taker took with him when he went from door to door, interviewing people and counting the members of their family. Nowadays, when you do a census, they mail you the form, you fill it out, you send it back to them. In the 1940s, and this is a page from the 1940 census, somebody actually came to your house and interviewed the people and asked for information from them. And this is kind of neat because this is a page from East Arlington. So when the census taker came, he would come to the first house and he would ask the people's names and ask who is the head of the household. This particular household is of Mr. John Hicks and his family. And so he wrote down Mr. Hicks's name there. Then he wrote down everybody else that lived in the household, starting with Mr. Hicks's wife, and then all of Mr. Hicks's children. If the Hicks family had extended family there, if a grandmother or an aunt or uncle lived with them, they would also have been listed on this. If the Hicks family had a servant, they would also be listed on there. If the Hicks family rented out a room and had boarders living with them, they would also be listed there. Then in the next column, they list Mr. Hicks as the head of the household, and then all the names under that, they say, well, how was this person related to Mr. Hicks? So I can count the families by counting the heads of the household. Then they ask for each member of the house, or each head of the household, do you own your house, or are you renting your house? And if they owned it, then they would put an O up there, and if they rented it, they would put an R there. And then in the column next to it, they ask the person, how much is your house worth? If the person owned it. And Mr. Hicks said that his house was worth $2,000. In those days, that was a whole lot more money than it is now. If the people were renting, then they would ask, how much is your monthly rent? And they would write the monthly rent down in the column right next to that. Then they would ask, how old are each of these people? That was really useful. I'll show you on a later slide how useful all this information is to me. So anyway, they wrote down how old the people were. What they wrote in this column I found very interesting. This was taken in 1940. They're asking, 5 years ago, where did you live? And what they're doing is seeing how stable is this neighborhood. Well, it was very interesting. In East Arlington, almost everybody lived in that same house 5 years earlier. This was a very stable neighborhood. People were not moving in and moving out. They were moving in and they were staying there. Then they would ask, does anybody in this household work? And if they do, then they would ask, okay, well, what kind of work do you do? Mr. Hicks was an undertaker. And they would ask, well, where do you do your work? And Mr. Hicks owned his own funeral parlor. Okay? This data was tremendously useful to me in doing this research. Then I also went up to the land record office in the courthouse. It's up on the 6th floor. Anybody can go up there, and you can look at any deed. Anybody who has bought or sold property in Arlington has to file a deed, and it's stored up in the land record office. So I'm rummaging around in the deeds, and I was really excited to find this deed. This was the deed that the War Department had to file with the land record office when they took East Arlington. So let me show you what it looks like. This is just the cover page that's got the number of the deed and so on it. In the next page, in this red box, the War Department is telling why they were allowed to do this. And it says, we're using eminent domain, and we're using this for military purposes. And during the war, that was good enough reason that they could take it. Then there are several pages like this. There were over 200 people families living in East Arlington, over 200 houses that were taken, land that was taken. They had to write down the name of every single person that they took their house away from them. So if your family lived in East Arlington and if your family owned the house they were in, I've got the deed up there. I brought the deed with me, or a copy of the deed. You can look on it and see if you can find your family's name on there, because every single person who sold a house, their name is going to be listed on this thing. And finally, the government had to hire a surveyor to do a survey of East Arlington, and this map is absolutely fascinating. It's really, really exactly done. It's so exactly done that he listed these little numbers along the edge. You can't see them there, but we've got it up there on the table. It's got the street address, so you can see what street, and you look at the number, and you can see what the street address of that lot is. And then the up and down letters on there, if I can make my thing work, that's the name of whoever was the owner, whoever they bought that property from. So you can go look on this map and see if you were one of the people whose families had to give up their homes, you can find the lot where your family was. I was so excited when I found this thing. Okay, now let's talk about building the Pentagon. Building the Pentagon was a miracle of construction. They built that whole enormous building in 16 months. They started in September of 1941, and they finished in January of 1943. So that's amazing that they built it that quickly. The reason they had to build it, they started in September of 41 before we had gone to war. But it was quite obvious that we were going to get dragged into that war, and so the Army had begun to mobilize. So it's growing bigger. They're beginning to draft people. They're going to the factories and saying, quit making cars and start making tanks, you know, all this. They're getting ready for the war. And so the War Department is getting bigger and bigger. Well, it was getting so big that they didn't fit in their building. And so they were having to rent space in other buildings. And eventually the War Department was spread out in 17 different buildings. What an inefficient and expensive way to run a war. This was not going to work for the War Department. So they decided that they needed to have a larger building, one that they could get everybody under one roof. So they start looking around in DC for a plot of land big enough that they could put a building that large. And there simply, in DC, there was no place to put a building that big. There simply was no room for that. And so they looked across the river, and there was Arlington, and Arlington wasn't nearly as built up then. And so they found some land, and that was where they decided to build it. Now, there was a lot of objection to this. At that time, almost the entire federal government was in Washington, D.C., and people did not want the federal government slopped out into the states around. Now, of course, we're used to it. There's federal government in Virginia and Maryland and West Virginia and who knows where else. But at the time, the federal government was all within the boundaries of Washington, D.C. So anyway, they agreed that they would do it in Arlington. And they started building in September of 41. Now I just found these statistics because I thought they were kind of amazing. To build the building, the footprint of the building, the land just covered by the building is 29 acres. That is a huge building. And then, of course, people had to get there from D.C. because even though the building was in Arlington, most of the people didn't live in Arlington. So they had to drive in from D.C., and so they had to park somewhere. So they have twice as much parking as they have building. I mean, there's all the parking lots around there. And then for people to get into the parking lots and so on, they had to put in a road network, and it was 30 miles of road by the time they got finished. Imagine how huge a piece of land that is that you have to put all that building and all that parking and all that roads. In the end, they wound up condemning 411 acres of land. That is an awful lot of land that they had to condemn. So let's see what 411 acres of land were that they took. Okay, here is Arlington National Cemetery. Well, now I can't get my clicking thing. Okay, there's the cemetery. The first thing they took was the experimental farm. This was a farm that belonged to the Department of Agriculture, so they didn't have to pay for it. It already belonged to the government. This was a farm where they were learning different insecticides and stuff. They were experimenting on using various insecticides to find insecticides that would kill the tomato bugs without killing the person that ate the tomatoes, that sort of thing. They took the experimental farm, and the experimental farm then was moved to Beltsville, and I don't know if it's still there now, but anyway, it was moved to Beltsville. So they took the experimental farm. I found this picture of the experimental farm. I absolutely love this picture. This picture looks like it's in Kansas. There's the farmer there sitting on the back of his little plow with his mule pulling it. The only thing that tells you that's not Kansas is there's a Washington Monument over on the top. So you could really fool yourself, then you're thinking, what's that thing over there on the edge? I love that picture. Okay, the next chunk of land is this one. It's called the Quartermaster Depot site. The quartermaster, I learned, is the office or the person in the Army who buys supplies and provisions. And he buys all this stuff for the soldiers, but when he buys it all, they deliver it to him. He's got to have it someplace to put it before he sends it out to the soldiers. So he needs a lot of, what's the word I'm trying to think? Warehouse space, thank you. He needs lots of warehouse space. They hadn't actually built any warehouses there, but this belonged to the War Department. They had planned on building warehouses. They decided, well, that's our land, and we could use it better by using that for the Pentagon. So instead of putting the Pentagon there, they saved that plot of land, or instead of building their warehousing there, they saved that plot of land for the Pentagon. Then they had to take this airport. This was an obsolete airport. It was still a little bit used, but very little because it was an extremely dangerous airport. There was one of the major roads that goes along the Potomac, and I don't remember now which one it was, ran right across the landing strip. And I found this cool picture of that. I don't know if that's Jefferson Davis Highway or what. It's a main road. And I don't know if that plane is landing or if it's taking off. But look at the cars going every which way, trying to get out of the way. And the funny thing is, look at the traffic signal over there. The airport people realized that that was kind of dangerous. They realized it was sort of dangerous having that runway and the road. And so they put up a traffic signal, and then Arlington County got real fussy, and they said, you can't put up traffic signals. That's our road. You can't do that. You have to take your signal down. So the airport people didn't take the signal down, but they did turn it off. So instead, the people are kind of on their own, just kind of dodging the airplanes. So like I said, they didn't use this one very much. This was privately owned, and the government took it away from them. Okay, finally, down here, I've got it labeled as industries. There was a brickyard, a coal yard, a cement plant where they made cement pipes and cement blocks. And then, there were some little refineries there. So there were a bunch of industries through there. And I found a picture of one. This is the West Brothers Brickyard. This was kind of the last of the brickyards. Arlington used to be a big brickyard place. Lots of bricks from the West Brothers Brickyard can be found in the bottom of the Library of Congress, of the Capitol building. A whole bunch of buildings downtown have got Arlington bricks in them, and the West Brothers Brickyard, I think, was the last one to go. This had been in the West family since 1844. So almost 100 years they owned that when the War Department came along and said, well, it's ours now. Okay. Now, there was one more plot of land, and this is the one we're talking about, East Arlington. Notice East Arlington isn't actually underneath the Pentagon. Here's the footprint of the Pentagon, and all those other plots of land are under the Pentagon, but the East Arlington isn't. So why did they have to take it? Because the road network, those 30 miles of road, some very important roads, had to run right where East Arlington was. So they had to take it down. It's not sitting underneath the Pentagon, but it is sitting where it was sitting where those roads are now. And so that was why they had to take it. Okay, and there was that lagoon I was promising to tell you about. Okay, so now let's look at East Arlington itself. We've seen it sort of a triangle shape. It's been kind of chopped off there and chopped off down there. All of this data I got off of the census. I think this is so interesting. I counted how many heads of household, and I found there were 218 families living in East Arlington. I counted just how many people there were, and there were just a little over 900 people living there. This was a very young neighborhood. Over 100 of those children weren't even in school yet. They were 5 years old or younger. In a neighborhood of 900 people, there were 100 kids who weren't older than 5 years old. It was a very young neighborhood. I added up the ages of all those people in the census, and I averaged it out, and they were only 29 years old, the average age. So that's a very young neighborhood. Then it was also not a particularly wealthy neighborhood. There were 218 families. Only 90 of them owned their own home. And 128 of them were renting their homes. So it wasn't a particularly wealthy neighborhood. It was a very young neighborhood, and we also saw it was a very stable neighborhood. People weren't moving in and out. People were staying put. Another mark, I think, that it wasn't a particularly wealthy neighborhood is there were 127 people that were just renting a room in somebody else's house. So there were kind of hard times. The average value of the house was $1,765. Now remember, Mr. Hicks's house was $2,000. So he actually had a more expensive house than most of the people. And that's what those houses were worth in today's money. And the average rent was $15. And in today's money, that's $250. So you can see this isn't a particularly wealthy neighborhood, is it? But very stable one and a very young one. And this is kind of a cool map. This is a map they've got in the Virginia room, and this is called a tax map. This map was made in 1935, and this also was a fun one. I would take this on interviews and show people the pictures, because this one is done so well. You can actually see the houses. They have the actual outline of the houses, so you could see what the houses look like, and people could find their own house on this one. Okay, now let's talk about eminent domain, because that's how the War Department was able to take that land. Eminent domain is a power we have given to the government to take private property and to convert it into something for public use. So we've given them the right to come and take our property from us, even if we don't want them to take our property. So they can do this whether you agree to it or not. And with eminent domain, the government can come in, and if they say, we need your property, you cannot say no. You have to sell them the property. Their eminent domain has expanded in the reach that the government has, but in 1942, there were 3 kinds of eminent domain. The first one is the government could take property, the government could build something on that property. You could not use the thing that the government built, but it built it on your behalf. And an example is a fort. The government takes property, they build a fort, you don't get to go live on the fort, but the fort is there to protect you. Okay, so that's the first kind. The second time is the government can take property, the government is going to build something on that property, but then you get to use the thing that the government built. And an example of that, of course, is the roads. They're going to build the roads, but you get to drive on the roads. The third example is the government is going to take property. The government's not going to build anything on that property themselves. They're giving it to another private entity, probably selling it to another private entity. The other private entity is going to build something on that property, and you get to use it. And the example that they give for that is the railroads. The railroad companies usually aren't government companies. The railroads need that land to put in the tracks, and you and I get to ride on the trains. Okay, so those were the kinds of eminent domain in 1942, and we know which one the government used on behalf of East Arlington. They took the property, they were going to build a road, we could drive on the roads. Okay? This is all the Constitution says about eminent domain. The way this is worded, you see that eminent domain was a given. It was a given, nor shall private property be taken for public use. Well, that is eminent domain. All the Fifth Amendment says is you can't do that without just compensation. So it's not saying you can't take the property, it's just saying you've got to pay them for it. And that's all that the Constitution says. This is in the Fifth Amendment. This is called the Takings Clause because they refer to condemning people's property and taking it away from them as taking. Okay? Let's see what that compensation looked like. The Constitution, the Fifth Amendment, is promising us just compensation. Let's see what that amounts to. There are a lot of different varieties of compensation that the government sometimes uses. The least compensation is called taker's gain. With taker's gain, the government says, this is the fair market value and this is what I'm going to give you. What a deal that is, huh? You're the buyer and you get to set the price. Don't you wish it were always that way? So the government gets to take your property and the government gets to tell you how much they're going to give for you. That's one extreme. The other extreme is called indemnity. With indemnity, the government is going to take your property, but you get to set the price on it. Okay, so it's whatever it's worth to you rather than whatever it's worth to the government. Now, there are a lot of gradations in there between. One of them is replacement of the property that was taken. Okay, sorry. Replacement of the property that was taken. What this means is that you've taken my property and you set a price on it, but that price I may not be able to buy another property for that same price, an equivalent property. With this number one thing here, the government is saying, well, if you buy another property that's very equivalent to that, we'll make up the difference for you, okay? So they have the option. Sometimes they do it that way. Another one is called relocation. The government's acknowledging that it costs money to move. And so they're saying, not only will we pay you for your land and the improvements on that land, but we're also going to pay your moving expenses. It costs you to have your utilities turned off here and your utilities turned on there. We'll pay you for that. The third one, if the property is a business, the government is saying, we know that you have sold business A to us, whether you wanted to or not. We've got business A. You had to shut down business A. You've bought business B, but you don't have business B up running, and you have no income coming in. We'll give you that income until you get business B going. Okay, so sometimes the government will do that. Another one says, okay, we recognize that when you had business A, over the years, you built up a steady, solid customer base. People knew about you, and they came to your business. Now you've set up business A or business B, and you've got it running, but no one knows you're there. So you're not getting as much money as you would otherwise, and so we will subsidize you for a little while you're building up your customer base. Okay? These are all options the government has. There's one more option that's called demoralization costs. And sometimes the government will say, we know how bad you feel. You had to give up your dear home. Your grandmother was born in that house. We know how much this is tearing you up. We will give you a chunk of money to try to make you feel a teeny tiny bit better about the fact that you had to move out of that house that you didn't want to move out of. Okay, which of these things do you think they used in 1942 when they took East Arlington? Got a guess? Takers gain, yeah. They set the price. Okay, so let's see what the people lost. This is a picture from 1910, but from what people told me, it did not change much between 1910 and 1942. This is a picture in East Arlington. You can see the houses were made out of wood. In 1910, these houses, I think, looked pretty good. Nothing looks tumble down about this at all. The only tumble down thing is the county hadn't bothered to run streets in there, nor had they put in sidewalks, nor did they put in curbing, nor did they put in guttering. So the county has not put in any infrastructure. Now in 1910, that might be understandable, but by 1942, they still hadn't put in any infrastructure. Even when they had put it in a whole bunch of other neighborhoods in Arlington, basically other neighborhoods in Arlington at least had paved streets. East Arlington, the county simply didn't put it in there. There's something else they didn't put in that you wouldn't be able to see. Underneath those roads, there normally would be water pipes. There was no running water in those houses. Instead, everybody had a well in their backyard. This picture just makes me so angry. The county was not willing to run water pipes in, but they were willing to send this well inspector out to people's houses to badger them about keeping their wells up to Arlington standards of sanitation. So we would pay for the well inspector, but we wouldn't just run the water pipes in. I don't get it. Okay? Another thing that's missing there that you couldn't see would be underneath the streets would be sewer pipes. The county didn't bother to run sewer into East Arlington. When they had run it into most other neighborhoods, they hadn't run it in here. Okay? Instead, everybody had an outhouse. It was in their backyard, as far away from the house as they could get it. This is Arlington. The land is clay, so it doesn't percolate, so you can't have a septic system. So these outhouses had buckets in them. And it was probably the little boy in the family's job to go out every time the sanitation crew arrived with their truck with a big tank on the back. The little boy has to run into the outhouse and get the bucket and take it to the back fence so the sanitation crew can dump it in their tank, and then he can put it back into the outhouse. So we could afford to pay sanitation crews to come and empty the buckets, and we could afford to pay the outhouse inspector, who's making sure that the outhouses are up to Arlington's high sanitation standards. It seems like it would have been a lot cheaper to just put in sewer pipes and get it over with. But what would I know? Okay, something else you can't see that the people lost was virtually everything they owned. Virtually everything they owned, they lost. The government didn't want it. The government wanted you to take your possessions with you. But the government notified people early February of 1942 that they had 3 weeks to get out. This is during the war, when this whole area was absolutely full of people who had come to help run the war. There was no place to move, and these folks are African American. And so they cannot just move in. I mean, if they could find a house, chances are no one was going to rent to them. They're given 3 weeks to move out. So they're cobbling together arrangements where they're moving in with their mother-in-law for a week in her guest bedroom, and then they move into their godmother's basement for a month, and then they move into someplace else for another month. I mean, all they're doing is they're just, what are they going to do? There's no place for them to go. And so almost virtually everybody that I spoke to lost virtually everything that they owned, because where were they going to put it? There was no place to put it. So they lost their possessions. The government didn't care, because the government said, please, take your stuff. We don't need it. You take it with you. And they couldn't, because they had no place to put it. So they lost virtually everything they had. There were 3 churches, 2 big Baptist churches, and then a little Daddy Grace church. Those 2 Baptist churches, this is the Mount Zion Baptist Church. There was also a Mount Olive Baptist Church. These churches, this one, Mount Zion, was built in 1930. So this church building is only 12 years old, and they had a big plot of land around it that they owned. The Mount Olive Church was older than that, but they had done a total refurbishment of it 2 years earlier, in 1940. Total refurbishment. 1942, they just leveled it. And the churches had no choice. Then all of the businesses and the industries and people's work got lost. I showed you on the industry section, I showed you there was the gas and oil companies. I could tell from the census 2 people worked there. 6 people worked down in that cement plant. 11 people worked in the coal yard. And 82 people worked for West Brothers Brickyard. Well, all of those industries were leveled. So those people were out of their work. They lost their employment. And of course, the people that owned those industries lost their industries too. But then within East Arlington, there were a lot of little businesses also. There were rooming houses, there were barber shops, shoe repair shop, there were grocery stores, there were garages, and I have a pound sign for the catering because I didn't know how many. Several people told me that they had relatives who cooked meals and took them down to the brickyard and the coal yard, because there were no cafeterias there and there were no restaurants there. And so these ladies would whump up huge batches of fried chicken and fried fish and stuff and carry it down there on a daily basis. I mean, the workers knew they were coming. The workers got paid on Saturday, then the ladies who did the cooking got paid on Saturday. They all lost their jobs. They had no house, they had no kitchen anymore to cook in, and anyway, those industries were gone. So those businesses were lost, and the people who worked in those businesses lost their employment. Let's see if they got just compensation. If you owned your home, you were paid what the government chose to give you for your land and any improvements on the land. The churches were paid for their land and any improvements on the land. The business owners were paid for their land and any improvements on the land, again, at the price that the government set. The owners of those industries and their employees lost their work. They lost their business or lost their income. They were given nothing for that. Remember, that was one of the possible kinds of compensation, was compensating you while you get your business set up somewhere else. The government didn't do that. So they were, all of a sudden, they had no income. Not only had they lost their house, but they had no income coming in. Nobody was paid for the loss of their personal possessions. The government didn't want their personal possessions. They understood that the people had no place to put them, but that was life. So they lost they lost virtually everything they had. I guess some people were able to hang on to their clothing. Some people were able to hang on to their dishes and their cooking utensils. They could take small stuff like that, but they lost their furniture. Nobody was paid for their moving expenses. Remember, that was one of the options. And if you rented, you got nothing. You got nothing. So you can decide if they got just compensation or not. There was another thing that actually wound up being more important than those things that I'm listing here, and that was their sense of community. And this was what I really learned from listening to people. People who were just blithely telling me this story, and then they start talking about their community, and they tear up and they stop talking. Their community, this was such a tight community. This is during segregation where if you needed a haircut, you couldn't go to the white beauty shop to get your haircut. You had to go to one of those 2 or 3 black ones in your neighborhood. So your neighbor is not just your neighbor, he's also the person that gives you haircuts. And maybe you're the guy that was doing the shoe repair. Okay, well, your neighbors can't go to the white shoe repair place when they need to have their shoes resold or half sold, but they can come to you. So this community is basically holding each other together. None of them would have made it by themselves, but because they were hanging on to each other, they were getting through segregation. They were getting through the pickle that they were in. And then all of a sudden, their community just disappeared. That was what they missed. You could replace the bedroom suite they lost, or the clothes, or the books, or the toys, but they could never replace that community. And people just express that over and over to me, what a huge loss that was to them. So one person said, we lost our community. We lost our homes, we lost our work. What was lost will never be replaced. We lost that kind of close-knit community. Some people have never lived in a community, so they don't know what it is. They live in homes, but they don't know what a real community is. I've never lived in this kind of real community. I've lived in a home, because I can go to whatever beauty shop I want to. These folks knew something special that most of us have never experienced, and then they lost it. Everybody that was in East Arlington, they got a place to stay, but it just tore up that community. Some of those people, you never did see them again because people scattered in all directions. They never came back here. When East Arlington got leveled, that really broke that community up. I just heard this over and over and over. That was the thing that really got lost. And that would have been a demoralization cost for the government to pay them for that. Needless to say, the government didn't pay them for that. Okay, so here are the people. They're about to get thrown out. They're going to be standing out on the front. If on moving day, the government brought in people to move you out of your house. That's how serious they were about this. They weren't going to put your stuff anywhere. They would just come into your house. If you had not emptied the house yourself, they went into your house and they dragged all your stuff out onto the dirt in front. So they came in and they moved you out. Now where are you going to go? You have no place to go. Luckily, somebody in East Arlington had the wherewithal to do a very Washington, D.C. thing. They hired a lawyer. Okay, I just said, good on you. They hired a lawyer who wrote a letter to the most sympathetic person who had any influence that they could think of. And who would that be? Eleanor Roosevelt. They wrote Eleanor Roosevelt a letter. I haven't seen this letter. I would love to see this letter. And basically, though, I read the letter said, what are we going to do? We haven't got time to find a place to live. You're not giving us enough money to buy a place. What are we supposed to do? Mrs. Roosevelt didn't like hearing this. This is not how Mrs. Roosevelt thinks you treat your citizens. So she sent that letter down to the House Military Affairs Committee, and that's what this newspaper clipping is. The clipping, it was interesting to read these clippings because the stories I'm hearing are from African American folks who lived through this, and then I read the newspaper, which has a very organizational, white, distant point of view. You read the newspaper and it's like, well, this isn't really happening to people, but we're having to, Mrs. Roosevelt has sent us this letter, so tomorrow we're going to have a big meeting and decide what to do. I would guess that letter had a little sticky on it that said, we don't treat our citizens this way, because the House Military Affairs Committee did come up with a solution. They brought in the Army. And just like when Katrina blew through New Orleans, the Army came in and they started putting down trailers. And they put them in 2 of the neighborhoods. They put them in Johnson's Hill and they put them in Green Valley. There were flat areas. Those are both black neighborhoods. Neither one of them was all that built up. So there was room where they could put in those trailers. And they just lined in trailers as quickly as they could. They would put those trailers in. Now this clipping is from March. So you can see it's kind of muddy, it's a mess. I'm sorry, this doesn't look very good. The only way I could get this picture was, I got it at the MLK library, and they didn't have the original photo. All I could do is stand over it and take a picture, take a photograph of it, so it's not that great. But it shows them dragging in a trailer, one after another, and as soon as they had a trailer dragged in, and as soon as they had it stabilized, they moved a family into it. Okay, so as quickly as they could, because there are families there that are just sitting there waiting to move into somewhere. They have no place else to go. So they brought in the trailers, And this is so sweet. The folks that I talked to were so positive. After all the things they had been through, they mentioned these watersheds because, did I mention with the wells that they couldn't drink the water from those wells? Okay, sorry, I left that out. They couldn't drink the water in the wells in their backyard, and the county hadn't run fresh water in. So the little kids would go to the experimental farm where there was a clean spring, and they would drag water back in buckets, which is a long haul. So one of the gentleman that I talked to had been one of the water carriers in his youth, and he mentioned very happily about how close these watersheds were, because this is in Johnson's Hill, and Johnson's Hill actually had running water, and so the kids didn't have to walk very far. There were little watersheds all over the place. So that was one positive thing about this. Okay, now this is a picture from a little later on. You can see it's a little more stable. This is probably in the summer. The government put in boardwalks because you saw how muddy the previous picture was. Here are the clotheslines for the ladies. Women's work is never done, right? These were trailers for small families that only had a couple children. Then they had these double wide trailers. If you had more children than that, you could get these double wide trailers. By the way, even though the government threw these folks out of their houses, when they moved in these trailers, they had to pay rent. They weren't just living there. And then after they got everybody under roof, then they began improving where they were living. So they brought, oh wait, I'm jumping ahead. Okay, this was the laundry house, so the ladies could do the laundry. This might have been an improvement over what they had because there's running water in here, and hopefully it was warmed up. And they also had community bathrooms, so the men on one side of the building and the women on the other side of the building. And then they began removing the trailers one by one and putting down these temporary houses. These are prefab houses. Apparently you could hear people talking in the other room through these ones. They were really not real sturdy, but they told me that these were a huge step up from the trailers. They had running water, they had electricity, and these were warm. Okay, so these were an improvement, and they moved people into these as quickly as they could, get them out of the trailers and put them into these prefabs. And then once people were a little more stabilized, they built these buildings. This is the Carver homes in Johnson's Hill, and they also put up the Dunbar homes in Green Valley. And these are still there. Dunbar homes is gone, but Carver homes is still there. And these people rented from the government until the war was over, and then the government sold them to folks. And they made a condo association and sold all of those units off, and people are still living in those. Meanwhile, back in East Arlington, on the 17th of April, all the people had been moved out. So the Army came in with their big bulldozers. They knocked those wooden buildings down. They just piled all that wood up in the middle, and they torched it. I think it's so sad. The only thing still standing is the brick buildings. It took a little more effort to knock the brick buildings down. But the wooden ones, it was just in one day. They got rid of all of those wooden buildings. They got rid of them. Meanwhile, look what's lurking over here on the horizon. There's the Pentagon about to go up. And this is what we have now. And these are the people that I spoke to who helped me out. So thank you very much. But instead of clapping for me, let's clap for the 903 people who moved out of their houses, were forced to move out of their houses, lost their possessions, lost their jobs, lost their community, so the War Department could efficiently run a war, which we won. Let's clap for those people.
Well, on our collective behalf, I want to thank Dr. Perry so very much for a really an inspiring talk. And I think probably, and by the way, East Arlington and Queen City are the same, right? Same. Yeah. I just want to be, because we were calling it Queen City for purposes of advertising the talk tonight. And so, and Queen City was only a small fraction
it's just a piece
of East Arlington.
But a lot of people refer to the whole thing as Queen City.
I see. Okay, great. Listen, before I give the floor back to Dr. Perry, just one question. I thought you said that, right, that the average home value was $1,765, and Mr. Hicks, his house was about $2,000. What was the average amount of money that the U.S. government paid to the homeowners when they took their homes?
You know, I could not find any information that told what people actually got. I don't think the government was trying, I really don't think the War Department was trying to cheat people, but I think they were a little, I mean, they had a war to win. They had blinders on. They had one thing that they were worried about. I don't think they were tremendously worried about that neighborhood. I honestly don't think they'd have been tremendously worried about that neighborhood if it had been white. I think they had a war to put on, and there was a community in the way, and they had to get them out of the way. And so they did. One thing I didn't mention is you could take them to court and demand more money, and the Mount Zion Church did. And they did get some more money. They weren't happy with what they got. Of course, when you're thrown out of your house, you're not going to be happy anyway, but I would guess that the people that had the wherewithal and took them to court would get a little bit more, but nobody was going to be happy about it no matter how much they were paid, because it was just such a sad thing that was happening to them.
The Stevens Lodge and the cemetery that is where the Sheraton Hotel is now on Columbia Pike, just across from the Navy part there. Do you know anything about that situation? I know that in the 60s, 1960s, the cemetery was bought and the bodies were moved. But is this at all connected to that historically?
No, that was a road building, but ladies back there, help me out. Florence, what do you know about that?
I'm speaking off the top of my head. Maybe if we go to the Virginia room, we could really get the dates and the facts.
Right.
But this was way after the Pentagon was built.
Right.
Because I grew up as a child, I was in the Mount Zion Baptist Church. Mm-hmm. And I remember once the government took the church, the Mount Zion Church rented what was called the Oddfellows Hall. Mm-hmm. It was a fraternal organization, and they lent it to the church for Sundays. It looked like a two-story brick and frame building, but around it was the Oddfellows Cemetery. And most black people who lived in the Queen City area, and even in Arlington View, say Johnson Hill, where I live today, most of the older families were buried in that cemetery. Uh-huh. But this happened later. It was there. They improved Columbia Pike, and then the Oddfellows were very older men, and I guess with the improvement of Columbia Pike and some other things, the Marine Corps military base backed up on the cemetery, on Oddfellows, right. And they were persuaded to sell because the guys were disbanding the organization. Right. They moved all bodies to what is known as the Coleman Cemetery on Route 1.
Oh, okay.
And after a few years, I don't know, I guess it was the Hotel Corporation, I'm not sure, but they purchased it. And I think all of that information is in the records of Mr. Edmund Fleet in the Virginia room, because he was one of the men trustees of that property. Right. And whatever they gave them, they covered the moving of the bodies. And later it was sold to, I believe, a Travelodge motel. The county put so many restrictions on them, they could not afford to build. So they sold it to the Sheraton Corporation.
Oh, thank you so much. You also brought up a good thing of where those churches went. The Mount Zion Church, as Mrs. Ross said, moved into the Oddfellows until you could build your own church, which they built in Green Valley. The Mount Olive folks went right into Johnson's Hill, and they put up a tent. And they had their services in a tent for a while they built their own building. And those two churches are going strong today. It took more than the War Department to discourage those two churches. They're doing very well. Thank you.
I remember Mount Olive moving into a tent. I was very young at the time, but we all worked for our church. And I remember moving into the tent. I remember moving out of the tent because we all worked to build Mount Olive so we could move in there.
Sir, why don't you
Grown-ups, the
introduce
kids,
yourself?
and all worked.
Introduce yourself.
My name is William Corbin. They call me Eddie.
Eddie was one of my
And I was-
informants. His name was on that slide.
Yes. I live right down the street from Mount Olive. Mount Olive is right there on Ridge Road. Up further was Mount Zion.
Right.
In between the two was Harmon's store. I can't remember it all, but I remember quite a bit of it.
Huh.
And I remember when we had to move. We moved into the Army trailers. We moved into the ones that was in Green Valley, right off of Glebe Road. And we were there for maybe 2 years or better. And then they built the barracks on Johnson Hill was one area, and we moved from Green Valley to Johnson Hill. And been there ever since.
All right.
My name is Ruth, excuse me. My name is Ruth Burton, and I'm a member of Mount Olive. I've been a member since about 80-some years now. I'm 95 years old,
All right.
and I remember,
Yay.
Mount Olive was down in like Queen City. I went
Mrs.
to
Burton, is
I went
this?
to Sunday school there. And
Let me
now
find
we're on 13th Road. And I remember very well when the Pentagon came in and taken our homes, didn't give us enough to buy another home, but we made it. And now I'm on 13th Road, 1531 South 13th Road.
All right.
I was born here in Arlington, 1011 Columbia Pike. That's where I was born.
Mrs. Burton, would it be okay if I tell them the story you told me about how your mother moved the house? Okay. Mrs. Burton's mother and Mrs. Burton was there also. They were living in a house in East Arlington, but when they had to move, they couldn't move. They couldn't physically move their house. It wasn't built so it could be moved. But a few of the houses were built in such a way that they actually could be picked up and moved. And Mrs. Burton's mother and Mrs. Burton engaged in that. They bought a lot over in Johnson's Hill, and they had this house moved over to Johnson's Hill, and Mrs. Burton is still in that house. Yeah. It's a lovely house. And then there's the Pentagon coming up. People told me that they had no idea what was coming. They saw the Pentagon being built. One man said they used to sit on the back porch in the evening and watch it. They had pile drivers going 24/7 for a year. That building is built on clay and muck. I mean, it's on the edge of a riverbank, so what's there? There's clay and muck. So they put down 41,000 piles to set that, so that they could set that building down on something solid. And they had pile drivers going day and night. And these folks, I think they didn't even hear the pile driver, but they would sit on the back porch and just watch, because the construction was going on 24 hours a day, which means at night they had these flood lamps on it so that they could see what they were doing, so they could see the work that they were doing. And people were sitting there on their back porch watching it without a clue, until all of a sudden the War Department shows up and says, okay, you've got 3 weeks and then you've got to move. So it's amazing, isn't it?
We have one question over here.
This is a very important study that you're doing.
Thank you.
But I hope that you know that this is very isolated, and this was happening all over Northern Virginia. I'm currently involved in a study about African American land ownership, and I call it condemnation or confiscation of African American land ownership. Even the university where you are, at George Mason, you go 1 block off campus, there's a historic marker for Rosenwald School. So what does that tell you? There was a black community there as well, as was at Wolf Trap, Fairfax Hospital, Dulles Airport. There was another airport actually proposed in Burke in the early 50s, and they took all that land and then decided to do it at Dulles. So there's a large history of African American, taking back the land that African Americans acquired after slavery. Okay? And many of the places that were contraband camps here in Northern Virginia
Right.
became black settlements. Okay? There were a number of them in Alexandria. Hall's Hill was Camp Rucker. There were a number of black communities and black small farms, including Audrick's Corner in McLean. There were 3 distinct African-American communities in McLean that during the 30s, when the government expanded because of the New Deal, there was a big push to develop communities here in Northern Virginia. And in the 60s, there were 6 Fairfax County supervisors that were indicted in federal racketeering charges for changing zoning ordinances with, so that developers could build communities here in Northern Virginia. So this is a very important study, but it's just the tip of the iceberg. I would like to talk with you.
Fine, I would like to talk to
Okay.
you. I just think it's a very moving story. Yes, sir.
Yes, could you elaborate a little more on the newspapers? I'm sure you read a whole lot of history of how the Pentagon was built, and I'm sure a lot of it focused just on the war effort and the organizational issues, but I'd love to hear more about how hard was it to find references to this drama going on?
Oh, like it might not have been in the paper? Yeah. I don't know how I could say it was in there a lot or it wasn't in there. I don't know what to compare it to, but there were a number of articles talking about these folks having to move. It just struck me how kind of dispassionate those articles were. That was the point I was trying to make, is there you're getting the white, kind of the, you know, management point of view, the official point of view, rather than, if you studied only the newspapers, you would not realize the kind of the blood, sweat, and tears that were also shed in this. Lucky for me, I had all these nice folks to talk to who told me what it was really like for their, and so for me it was very interesting to contrast the newspaper, which is just so dispassionate about the fact that these people are having to move out. Like that article about Mrs. Roosevelt, where well, really all we care about is that the House Military Affairs Committee is going to meet on this day because some people are being moved out. No story about what's happening to these people or who the people are or what they're about to lose.
Another question over here.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm sorry if you already covered this, but how long had the community been there, the whole community, East Arlington?
okay, good
and
question.
I
I
think you
can
said
actually
the
answer
date
that one.
for, I think you said the date for Queen City too, but I wrote down 1492, and that can't be right, so. Thank you.
Close, very close. You got the 92 right. 1892 was Queen City. And sir, you mentioned a good thing about the contraband camps. The people from Queen City, actually the people from those 2 churches, Mount Zion and Mount Olive, had come down from Freedman's Village, which was a contraband camp. And they were closing it, and that's why Queen City was purchased. And then 12 years later, in 1904, was when the land for East Arlington was purchased and platted. So those people did come from that contraband camp, from Freedman's Village. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, thank you for your talk. Can you elaborate a little bit more on the business community? Those businesses were gone. Were those owned by African Americans?
The industries?
Yeah, if people had to pay rent going into the trailers, where did they work? Where did any of those companies get set up somewhere else? Can you just talk a little bit about that?
The industries, I believe, were all white-owned, and I don't know. They were paid, and I don't know where they went. I mean, it was during the war. It would not be politically correct to object, would it? I mean, you gave up for the War Department during the war, I think. They were given their money and they went somewhere. I have no idea where they went. The industries or the businesses within the community, I've not heard of any of those businesses that actually moved to somewhere else. The only business that I heard that moved, and I found this very interesting, there was one gentleman who was a huckster, meaning that he sold vegetables and fruit and I think fish sometimes, Mr. Vini, and ice. And I spoke to his daughter, and she said it really had no impact on his business at all because his business was on the back of a truck rather than being a brick and mortar business. So he went wherever his customers went. And so that business continued on. But the businesses that were in somebody's home, those were the ones that I had listed on the bottom of that slide, the barber shops, the beauty shops, those were mostly businesses that were in somebody's home, which was very typical of African American businesses during segregation. It was inexpensive if you had like a basement that you could fit out to be, a beauty shop or something, rather than building a brick and mortar business of your own. And so when the homes were taken, of course, the business was lost also.
People have to survive. And I was a kid, and like Mr. Corbin, probably very young, and didn't think about it. But once they had to move, more women went to work doing day work. They took care, basically women took care of the families. But by building the Pentagon, most of the men who worked in the brickyard, they took employment as construction workers helping to build the Pentagon. So that's how the family survived.
You raise a really good point, because I believe you're the person who told me once the Pentagon was built, a lot of people got jobs at the Pentagon as messengers or elevator operators or custodial. So it generated work.
Cafeteria, but basically a lot of the elderly men, as you said, everyone has died, our older relatives and friends, but they worked, they helped to build it.
Yeah.
They got they took, the government took the local people and put them to work.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if you could go back to your maps and indicate to us the names of those major roads that outline this, kind of give us a way to, keep this in perspective. But you had the one map which showed the mixing bowl on 395. None of that existed. So, and I don't know when Shirley Highway came in, at that time. So I'm wondering where this all is, because I read an article that the Pentagon originally was going to be right up tight against the Memorial Bridge. And then when they moved it south,
Yes.
and that's when they took East Arlington.
Okay. So Columbia Pike ran down here. It ran right past East Arlington and then went down and went across what was called Long Bridge. Now we call it 14th Street Bridge. And Arlington Ridge Road ran along here. That stretch of Arlington Ridge Road, I think, isn't there anymore. I don't believe so. Those were the main streets there. And then there was what they call number 1 highway, Jefferson Davis Highway. That was in there. But all this tangle of roads, those weren't there. There wasn't very much there.
Could I add on to that and ask you if you could tell us where Johnson's Hill is and where Green Valley is in relationship to?
Sure. Johnson's Hill is still there. It's called Arlington View now. And it's up Columbia Pike, up the hill. If you went maybe past the Navy Annex and then you turn left, it would be right about there. Well, yeah. So Green Valley is now called Knock.
It doesn't exist?
It's called Knock. Knock.
Oh, okay.
Yes. Those are two completely different neighborhoods.
This location of the Pentagon was selected by late August 1941, and the basic design was done over the next month or so. Why did they wait so long before telling people that they needed to leave?
I don't know why they waited so long, but the building of the Pentagon, there's an excellent book. Now, of course, I can't think of the Steve Vogel, excellent book about the building of the Pentagon. And he talks about how the building of the Pentagon was going so fast. They were building it so quickly that there really was nobody out in front. I mean, it was just coming. They have this joke that he tells in there that apparently was very true, that when the carpenters were doing the say the plumbers were doing their work, and then the electricians came in, and then the carpenters are doing the finishing work, and they would joke that they better hurry because the painters are right behind them, and if they didn't hurry up and finish the part that they were working on, their tools were going to get painted. I mean, it was just moving as quickly as possible. And they were doing like one section of the Pentagon. It just started in one section, and they were just moving around. Put down the piles, start putting down this, put this, and as soon as the piles are in, you're moving on, you're doing the piles for the next section. Not the next fifth, the next fourth of a fifth, you know, the next section. They're just moving along like this. And the other people are following right behind them. And sometimes the plans for it were drawn retroactively. That section had been built already when the guys would come in with the plans. And as soon as there was any little section done, which was about the time that they leveled East Arlington, it was in April, they started moving secretaries in. They'd only finished one little piece of the building, but they were getting people in there as fast as they were. That's how big a crunch they were in. That's how big a hurry that they were in. So the thing about notifying this neighborhood, it probably never occurred to anybody. They were probably just worried about, you know, about the fact that the painters were behind them and they had to hurry up or their tools were going to get painted. They really were just going so quickly.
Just one thing about the construction of the Pentagon, at a plug for the Arlington Historical Society Museum, which is in the Hume School, the red brick schoolhouse on Arlington Ridge Road, which is our museum. It's open on weekends, but we have a little bookshop in there. And we do have, I was over there today, and I noticed several copies of the Vogel book on the construction of the Pentagon. So
I think it's just called The Pentagon.
The Pentagon, right. So if you're really interested and you don't want to go to Amazon this time, you could come over on the weekend, 1 to 4, Saturdays and Sundays, and purchase a copy for your own use.
It's a really good book. It really, and it gives you that idea about how they were moving so quickly and nobody dared even stop. They'd have fallen over kind of thing. Yes, ma'am.
First, if the whole premise of taking this property away and what is this called? Under the government's allowed to take the property away because the public can use the roads, eminent domain.
Yes.
How many of these people had cars? How many of them could have used these roads? And second, what happened to the undertaker in his $2,000 house? Where'd he go?
I don't know what happened to Mr. Hicks. As far as the roads, the roads were the people who lived in D.C. who were coming out to work.
I'm sure it was just an oversight, but we're talking about a huge Pentagon where the combined services would all be under one roof, not only the Army but the Navy. And they came from, correct me if I'm mistaken, from what is today called the Eisenhower Executive Office Building, which goes back to the 1880s. But they were overcrowded there, and as you said already, were spreading out all over Washington in leased space. But the idea was to keep them together, I think, under or get them back together under one roof, Army and Navy. And then, of course, in 1948, during the war, we also created an Air Force, and it was to be for all of them in one roof. Is that correct?
I believe you're correct. They called it for a long time, rather than calling it the Pentagon, they called it the War Department building. So it was whatever the War Department encompassed at that time. This was to keep them all under one roof.
On behalf of all of us, I'd like to thank Dr. Perry so much.
Thank you.